He just looks like a Halloween costume.
Physically hurts me. I'm in physical pain.
This ain't it. And if there's any, like, a tier lower than this ain't it, I would put it there. I would put it there.
This is not looking like a good year for period dramas. Yikes. It is time for the costume review shenanigans of 2023. For those of you who are new here, welcome to this massive extravaganza of ranking every piece of historical media that has been released in 2023. Or at least all the pieces of media we were able to find. Why? That is an excellent question. You know what? Just vibes, just funsies. Also because I know many of you in the audience enjoy watching period dramas and may or may not wish for maybe a little guide for which pieces of media can be relied upon to provide some hypothesis of what these periods might have looked like versus which pieces should be viewed just as purely artistic or fantastical or just, you know, pieces to enjoy. I mean, several of these are favorites of mine. We are, of course, also not here to roast any of the costume designers because there are so many factors that go into the ability to physically produce clothing at a more or less historically appropriate scale. So let us go through the rankings. The top of the tier, the top of the list, the creme de la creme, 'tis peak, my lord, straight up ankle in this establishment. These are for the titles that, to the best of 21st century ability, have achieved a really strong hypothesis of what these periods might have looked like in real life. They're sticking to construction method, they're sticking to materials, they're sticking to silhouettes that we have evidence of in these periods. The tier below that is it gets the job done. The silhouettes are pretty much there, the materials are pretty much there, the construction is pretty much there. There may or may not be a few things that are not quite right, but for the most part, we can definitely tell what period this is supposed to be, and none of these choices really pull us out of the world of the period. Below that, we have They Tried, affectionately. We can see that there was period research done. They've clearly made a couple of really good decisions, but there are enough really curious choices that really kind of pull you out of the world of the story. The tier below that, and this is technically the bottom tier, the lowest tier, this ain't it. It's kind of oldie-timey in a way that doesn't communicate the very specific period in which this is supposed to take place. There are very deliberate and very blatant anachronisms and or, of course, choices that are made sort of insensitively. If you're trying to represent another culture and you're not doing that well, this is the tier for that. The next tier, which is not the lowest tier, I don't want to call this the lowest tier, but it is like structurally just down there, but I've tried to delineate it with like a white box saying this is a tier in and of itself. It was a design choice. This is for titles that are clearly meant to be depicting a sort of an alternate universe, a heightened artistic vision, perhaps fantasy or sci-fi. We are not having this category be a sort of exemption from doing period research. We want to say they've done period research, they're taking inspiration from history, but they aren't going for historical accuracy and they aren't going for historical representation, and so therefore we want to put them in a separate category. Backed by popular demand, I have also made up a bingo card again for this year if you would like to play along in spotting these historical costume sins for yourself. Good luck. Let me know what timestamp you get bingo at below. So we're going to start our journey today in 1920s New York with the sponsor for this video, June's Journey. June's Journey is a thrilling murder mystery story following our protagonist, June Parker, who is on an elaborate quest to uncover all of her family's many secrets. The story unfolds over dozens, if not hundreds, of carefully crafted hidden object scenes. I'm on chapter like 75 or something, and June's family drama is still going very strong. And in addition to the hidden object scenes, you can also build out your own little island with coins and little treasures you find along your searchings. I've been enjoying this game for a number of years now as a really great way to just relax and unwind at the end of a long, stressful workday. So for stunning artwork, a fascinating story, and immaculate Jazz Age vibes, I'm going to have to go ahead and give June's Journey a 'tis peak. Download June's Journey for free by clicking the link below or scanning the QR code on screen. June's Journey is available on iOS and Android mobile devices, as well as on PC through Facebook Games. So, beginning in 7th to 3rd century BCE India, we have Adipurush.
There was metal armor at this time, but it wasn't like the stuff that you see in like the shows and the movies that's like that, like, you know, it carved out muscle armor. The other thing is that there's a lot of references to sewn armor, so that's really, really cool. Helmets also absolutely did exist. Beyond that, though, we tend to go the fantasy armor route, extremely fantasy armor. It's like this movie wants to be Lord of the Rings and literally even has scenes of like Mordor-like setups for Ravana, which makes no sense because it's the tropics. Ram and Lakshman, his brother, they are warriors. They are princes, and the way that they are dressed is a little bit odd. One of the casual items of clothing that was worn by a warrior man would have been deerskin, and obviously you see none of that in this. Every time they put him in that weird skin color shirt, though, I wanted to riot. Once again, you're gonna find me mad about shirts. Anytime a man wears a shirt in this movie, I want to throw something. In like early Vedic times, like straight up no shirts. It was a bottom wrap and a top wrap. You got double shawl situations going on. The bottom wraps, they do really great with that. All wrapped pants, love to see it. It was great. This is the period of time where Indian fashion is and continues to be really, really gender neutral, and the majority of people all wore the same thing, which was the wrapped garment around the legs and a wrapped shawl, and then a lot of jewelry. And you know, I always just want more jewelry for the men. You sort of notice that all the women are wearing bandeaus instead of full blouses, which I really loved. That was fantastic. But then we come across a secondary problem, which is called the sari literally doesn't exist. It doesn't exist yet. Everything else is just so fantasy bad and can't decide what period it wants to be. Oh my god, the vibes are all over the place. It is, for lack of better word, whack. I still have to put it on This Ain't It because combined with everything else, it really ain't it.
We are starting off strong this year. All right, heading up to the year 30 CE to biblical lands, we have The Chosen.
So the good thing about The Chosen, which I have seen, is they use variety. It's not just 50 shades of beige. There's color, there's pattern, there are different fabrics, there are different styles. But almost all the necklines have this little V shape, so you can pull it over your head, which was not a thing with tunics. And cutting a V would also mean you would have to finish it, so it means it would be sewing. They're so weird, and you can obviously see the shoulder seams and the arm size seams. There was seaming done in this time, but it was very, very basic. And the Roman dress is just, it's all over the place. Weird necklines again, some drippy fabric sheets. There's this one woman, and she has a kind of tiara that looks like that Russian crown, the kokoshnik. I've never seen it before in my life. And it looks like they watched the Disney movie Hercules and they thought, we want this in our show. He has a headband, it's pinned, it has a massive border. He just looks like a Halloween costume. There was obviously some intent of variety. I would rank this with they tried.
All right, that is a slight improvement. Off to 60 CE in Celtic/Roman Britain, we have Boudica.
Yeah, like there's some decent Roman soldiers in this. There is some good armour, like there's some actual Roman looking chainmail, and there's the segmented armour, which was a thing. You love to see it. It's nice to actually see metal armour being worn, because so many shows that have Roman soldiers, they're all wearing leather armour, which is really weird. Some of the swords look quite cool. It's nice to see Celts wearing actual armour and equipment, not just like animal skins and weird makeup. Having said that, the Trinovantes are all wearing animal skins and weird makeup, so I don't know, like maybe some barbarians are less barbarian than others? I don't get it. The makeup and the animal skins is all really weird, and we have some beautiful textile remains from the Roman imperial period from non-Roman people, so like, I don't get it. Overall, Romans and Iceni look kind of okay. And like Boudica generally seems to be dressed quite nicely in like high Roman fashion, which is a fun choice. Like she would have had access to Roman imperial traders and merchants and clothing and accessories and that kind of stuff, so like nice to see that. Catus Decianus and soldiers. His soldiers are wearing 16th or 17th century helmets that are more likely to be worn by conquistadores. I don't know why they're wearing them. Also, his red leather helmet looks really dumb. Anyway, it's not great. It's not peak. There's so much bad in it, though. There's so much in it that is just bad. It was a design choice. It's not the best. It's not the best.
All right, we have some tier diversity so far, I guess. All right, off to 1st century Rome, we have season 2 of Domina.
At first glance, it's fine. The silhouette is correct. The drape of the garments is correct. There's lots of color, and we love to see color in Roman and Greek times. And then when you look closer, things start to get a little bit silly. They're still going with the cuffs and the belts, like the men just want to be Wonder Woman or something. And jewelry was a very feminine thing. So no respectable Roman men would wear jewelry, maybe apart from a ring, but definitely no cuffs, no belts, no necklaces, none of that. The tunics are also very weirdly constructed with the weirdest form of joinery I have ever seen, like some kind of ribbon attachment. No, they were seamed and then pulled over the head. It was very simple. It was very basic. The one thing we always say this, we don't want exclusively white in antiquity because there was lots of color. But now in early imperial times, tunics and togas were like exclusively white because the white color would show your status. It would show that you are wealthy enough to afford to wash your immense toga, which in this period was almost 5 meters in width. It would be wool and it would be so heavy. The togas in this series are more like bedsheets. They do have stripes on the togas, so thank you very much. But then we get to the biggest flaw in any period piece, which is loose hair. No Roman woman would wear her hair down. There are only a couple of occasions where a Roman woman would wear loose hair. If she were a goddess, if she were giving birth, or if you're in mourning. So please people, stop with the loose hair. I would rank this as it gets the job done. When you look at it, it's fine, it's Roman, they did their best. It's only when you look closer that you see some things that don't make sense.
All right, it gets the job done. Cool. We're doing something. Okay, the Winter King in 6th century Arthurian times in Britain. Jimmy, take it away.
See how we feel about MGM plus trampling all over my people's culture. I am deeply, deeply unimpressed by the Winter King. So it's meant to be Arthurian, right? So it's meant to be sub-Roman. So you would expect people to be wearing like lots of wool, lots of rucked wool tunics and trousers and maybe leg wraps for the men, long geometrically cut dresses for the women. There are some really bizarre choices in this. Like there's so few identifiable garments. What do I call the leather buckled yoke cape cloak? There's lots of animal skins, there's lots of fur, lots of chrome tanned black leather with metal studded to it in random places. Nimue has like this really scooped green dress type thing that looks cold. It was cold in Britain 1,500 years ago. I don't get it. The rope-based accessories in this show are truly mind-boggling. It's so random. It's so weird. So Owain, he's wearing like gigantic, full-on like hemp rope cuffs and just massive pieces of rope all over his body. It's like when the costume designer for Vikings was talking about her choices, she was like, oh, we want all of this texture. We wanted loads of texture. I'm like, okay, but wool has texture. Like the texture doesn't have to be outlandish, weird, bizarre, impractical nonsense. And there's some haircuts in this that are strange. Like Guinevere has the classic like buzz cut sides and the big blonde pleats. One of the knights has like full like faux hawk situation that then becomes a mullet. Derval, who's one of the main characters, has just got full mullet going on. I don't understand. I don't understand anything happening in the show. Honestly, it doesn't even seem like they tried. It's very disappointing. It ain't it. It ain't it. Not cool. Deeply unsexy.
Jimmy has a whole video reviewing this if you would like to go hear some more thoughts, but this is not doing it. Ponniyan Selvan II. It's the second part to the film that came out last year. This takes place in the 10th century in South India.
99% of the women in this movie, leading ladies included, which was the gripe last time, are wearing some sort of bandeau. And breast bands and a sort of bandeau sort of wrapping are technically accurate for this period, although a lot of women did decide to go topless fully. But, you know, I understand for our modern sensibilities that we can't just have a bunch of naked ladies. But I will say, very happy. There was only one blouse that I could find, and you know, one is better than almost all of the main characters last time. So that was great. That was a 100% improvement. Like I said before, the sari actually does exist at this point. It was starting, so there is something to be said for that. Once again, though, we have the men wearing weird shirts. They're not tank tops, they're not real shirts. Some of them are skin-colored as though to make you think that they're shirtless, but I'm like, come on. At least put them in armor, because every single one of these guys are supposed to be warriors. So it's like, you could put them in armor, and that would be okay, but nope. They were just like weird t-shirts without arms. This is what we're doing. And I'm like, all right, fine. Like I said last time, I also am still very mad about the absolute lack of bling for the men. These guys should have like 100,000% more jewelry, because jewelry at this time was way more detailed and way more interesting than you could imagine. One of the things that are actually common in the Chola dynasty are pearls, because they are, you know, by the water. There should have been a bajillion pearls and everything, and like multi-stranded pearls. Frankly, it was a missed opportunity on jewelry, because there is so much more that they could have done. However, there is one thing that I am incredibly pleased with. Her hairstyle is actually an extant example of a Chola hairstyle. It is truly fantastic. It is one of like the more unique hairstyle examples that are seen or discussed in medieval Indian fashion at all. So the fact that it is there makes me think that somebody must have done some sort of research here and tried. And the lack of blouses this time makes me also think the same thing. But unfortunately, the men are still wearing shirts, and I cannot get over that. And that is why I must give this "it gets the job done." Somebody clearly did some homework, and then you know what? I respect that.
All right. I was getting a little bit worried with the This Ain't It being the leading category there, but okay, at least we're tied now. Vikings Valhalla Season 2, which takes place in 1002 up to 1066 in Denmark or what is now London.
I'm so excited. There's a fundamental misunderstanding of how armor works in the period. Nobody in this scene looks great. Like, everybody looks kind of shoddy. There are a couple of dudes wearing just full, like, they look like suede leather aprons, like lumps of metal sewn across them. The Emperor Romanus is like a weird highlight, because they've clearly found images of Byzantine emperors, and they found mosaics of Byzantine emperors wearing the scale armor and the Byzantine imperial crown. They look equally derpy, and the things line up kind of like they've tried so hard with him. You've got to give them credit, because they've tried so hard. It's good enough. Freydis at one point is just wearing a full polar bear on her head, which is an exciting choice. And it's clearly made out of the scraps of like the artificial fabric fluff that you get on trims and on like comfortable sofa throws that you decorate your lovely beige house with so that it will sell more easily. It's just impractical. Everybody's clothes look so impractical. Like, the dresses are either too long, or there's so many different layers of interacting scraps. I don't understand. There's a great picture of Queen Emma where, like, it's difficult to know how her dress works. It looks like it's just been 3D rendered and then superimposed onto her. It's just very, very odd. And I feel like they've tried to make Emma and Godwin and some of the other English characters look much, much later. Like, they've tried to make them look Tudor or Renaissance, but they've tried to make them look the Tudors rather than Tudor period. So they're all in like sexy body-hugging, dark colours, and none of it works. None of it looks like the clothing of the period, and it looks bad, and everybody looks like they're having a terrible time, and the costumes look uncomfortable. This also ain't it. Hurts me. Physically hurts me. I'm in physical pain.
Next, we have in 1278 in southern Pilsen, which is the current Czech Republic, we have a film called The Outlaw, or what translates to The Outlaw.
The costumes are reflecting both what village people wore and also the armor and battle gear worn in the 13th century. I do really like that they are quite simple. I like the fact that the heraldic imagery isn't too complicated because it gets like really detailed in the 16th century, 15th century, sometime like that. I have one major question. We have this guy with this massive helmet cover with feathers. No idea what's going on there. Didn't find anything about that. Otherwise, the helmets and armor seems quite accurate. You can see that they're wearing like quilted jackets underneath their armor, and that's a great detail. Some of the background dresses are quite bright. There's one scene. The blue gowns are a bit very blue, actually. So the colors aren't necessarily the most accurate. However, the silhouettes look amazing, and you can see in close-ups, you can see all of the detail of like the hand stitching and whatnot. But by far, my favorite thing about the costumes has to be the detail on some of the necklines, the embroidered detail. And you can tell that in the movie, the embroidery is actually hand done. It's inconsistent, it doesn't look like perfect, which is great because this is actually a crowd-funded movie. So the fact that someone who didn't have like studio money managed to put this level of detail into one movie is so good. So I will give the costumes a very high gets the job done. It has great details, but some of the background stuff, some of the foreground stuff, they kind of stick out like an eyesore.
Okay, very high ranking, it gets the job done. Okay. Off to the 13th century in England, we have The Last Kingdom, 7 Kings Must Die. Sounds ominous.
The overwhelming colour palette is once again blue-grey. There's just this obsession with washing out the early medieval period. You even see it in really well-costumed stuff, like in The Northman. A lot of the tint is on the blue end of the spectrum. Yeah, it's cold, but it's colourful. Like, it's cold, and people are wearing reds and yellows and pinks and browns. So we've got lots of men in armour, and their armour looks terrible. There's a dude here whose chainmail sleeve extends over his hand. That really hurts. Like, chainmail's quite sharp. Dreadful, like, droopy bishop's mantles, but they're just so clearly knitted. And it just looks bad. None of them have got shields. An essential item of your weapon system is missing. Also, the guy just full on wearing a puffer jacket in the middle and a hoodie. Like, he's going down the precinct to smoke with his mates, but he doesn't look like an early medieval warrior of any sort. Nah, it's bad. Animal skins everywhere, grey, boring, buzzcut sides, everybody's dressed in fantasy gear. It's fantasy gear, but it's nice to see a brightly lit interior in a Viking Age show. So very, very glad to see that. That genuinely was a nice change. Hooray! Amazing. Uhtred still looks like he's been punked. Like, this looks like a prank. Like, nobody would willingly dress like this in the period, so he still looks dumb as rocks, but his moustache looks nice. I'm voting everything so badly. Oh no. Is there something? Is there anything? Can I find a picture that would redeem it? Let me look. Let me just look. There must be something that means I can bump it up. Oh god. Oh no, he looks awful. Oh, there's a Thor's hammer. There's a Thor's hammer pendant, but he's wearing it over basket weave armor. No, immediately no. No, sorry, this ain't it. I tried.
Oh man. This is heartbreaking. This is heartbreaking. If there's one thing I want from this year, it's for This Ain't It to not be the leading category, please. We've learned so much over the years, please. Okay, moving on to the late Joseon period, roughly around 1800s Korea, we have Secret Romantic Guesthouse.
So it follows the story of a noblewoman running a guest house, and she has scholars and a cast of characters who stay with her, and there have been a lot of choices, a lot of stylistic choices that may have not been period typical. The women's wear, it sort of jumps back and forth between a below the waist, longer jogori top to going up as we go through history. It's not quite at the historically accurate late Joseon where it would actually expose the breasts. However, a lot in this drama in public they forgo headwear, which is a really, really, really strongly encouraged law almost to Koreans in terms of Confucian modesty and philosophies. Of course, this all goes down to type of hat. Straw hats, like the perangi, would have been for a more common class, but we are having some play around with different class, different textile. The huklip hat, all of these were different rankings of the yangban nobility and what status you were. Their depiction of the king at this time, I'm happy on the lack of scalloped edge around the dragon emblem on his robes. However, the black Korean robes underneath, traditionally, they would have been white in historic precedent, but I completely understand that this is more of a fun romantic comedy that just so happens to be set in Korean modern derived clothing. They have taken a more artistic representation. You know, there's bandits, villains. They have some real curious use of leopard furs. So I would give this they tried, but more on the side of this ain't it.
Sticking around to Korea, although we are time traveling a little bit back because I put these out of order, to the mid-Joseon period, we have the Matchmakers.
In dating this drama, it's a little around the decades and harder to clock. Their court robes are more representative of the Chinese Ming Dynasty robes. So you'll see the wings of their samo hat, maybe a little more rectangular, and different hairstyles for women, such as something called the yomori, which is a giant braided circular wig with circular golden accessories around it. This once again is another Ming Dynasty inspired hairstyle, but this sort of fell out of popularity due to the fall of Ming into the Qing Dynasty. The specific ritual garments such as the funerary sangbok with the rough hemp textile, this is all really accurate in Korean funerary tradition, as well as the wedding hwara ensemble. However, this is where you can see how dramas are distinctly affected by the time in which they're made. While the cut, the ideas behind it are completely accurate, maybe the colorway is a little bit more pastel, definitely reflecting sort of modern Korean tastes. And I totally understand in history, different women would have different taste styles, different classes if they inherited garments and such, but there is a pretty broad range in what we're seeing in lengths. Once again, it's the villains in their leopard furs. Now, a lot of these depictions in dramas will take in almost tribal northern parts of Korea, Manchuria as the villains, so I can understand the basis, but once again, it gets very archetype villain wear. So I would have to say it was a design choice.
Next, we have The Assassin, which is set in the general Joseon period, which, by the way, is a period of like 600 years or something. So, like, it's a broad period, but it's somewhere in there.
Now, his garment itself is a lovely, fantastical choice. Understandably, commoners' garments don't make it to museums, as they would have been used and used and used till they were barely scraps and then used some more. So a lot is conjecture, but what we have record-wise, I do not think would be the quilted pleather collar, curved shoulder, vest, all black ensemble. There are some very, very strong choices in terms of the gisang, the court entertainers, wearing some really glittery sheer, what looks to be under any light, polyester. So I haven't necessarily seen sparkle sheer in traditional Korean garmenture, but you know, who's to say? The villain of this story, Li Bang, I think actually has some of the more accurate costuming. Traditional indigo blues as his sort of higher up official status, wearing a Po coat. I actually am more fond of his costuming evolution and track than I would say most everyone else's. Yeah, it's just a lot of modern liberties. It's a action movie dressed in Korean-ish clothing. So for that, I would, with respect, give it This Ain't It. So next up is Our Blooming Youth. So this follows the K-drama adventures of Prince Li Huan and the Framed for Murder Jae-yi. This I commend on more appropriate use of traditional Korean embroidery. Very plain, unadorned. That being said, it does not mean not a brocade or a damask or pattern silk, but a lack of embroidery is a Korean hallmark of this period at least. There are some lower class danryang robes, which are the round collar robes. Green was a very accurate color, but in this there are some questionable bright shades, but still lovely, still in traditional Korean fabric, but definitely choices in terms of, once again, the modern aesthetic. On the more commoner aspect of things, I feel like a common thing to see nowadays are the calf wraps on men. A lot of lower class men, they would tie them at the calf for easier mobility, but for this, I don't know if it's more of a costuming quick rigging. The military garments, once again, are sort of the showing of the designer, production team, director, producers' tastes and what they want to see in sort of venturing out of historical accuracy. Military hats, categorized as porit, they would have been made out of a boar's hair, where these depictions are out of a felt. You would have seen a lot more texture in across-the-board garments. I definitely like some things, and definitely in terms of the historic meaning behind the set and production design, I would give this a they tried.
Why am I happy about receiving a they tried? This is not looking like a good year for period dramas. Yikes. Alright, let's see how Ming Dynasty China has to hold up here with Under the Microscope.
So, Under the Microscope tells the story of a talented mathematician from Wanli era, Ming Dynasty. Firstly, I have to give a round of applause to the costume designer, because the show effectively uses clothing to shape characters, differentiate classes, and convey identities. For instance, laborers naturally wear shorter garments, while those of higher social status wear longer, more sophisticated robes. Take the main character, Shuai Jiamo, who wears straw shoes, patched linen clothes, and a messy hairstyle. This choice effectively portrays a neurodivergent genius solely focuses on mathematics. In contrast, his friend, a county student, wears a long robe, 直多, made out of silk. This immediately highlights the class and personality differences between them. The overall male costumes pay attention to historical accuracy. There's one minor but extremely important detail. All male characters tie their hair up into a bun, and many of them use mesh hairbands, which is historically accurate. However, a notable drawback is the absence of hats and hair covers for many male characters. In Ming Dynasty, men typically cover their hair with kerchiefs and hats regardless of social class. For example, in this image, I would add hair covers for both characters, a structured hat for Feng Baoyu and a fabric kerchief for Shuai Jiamo. Unfortunately, the female costumes fall very short. Feng Baoyu's sister, her style lacks the common Ming Dynasty 马面 skirt, 马面裙, makes it difficult to tell the era and style. The proportion of her shirt is also not period correct. I give her an outfit somewhat like this image. Insert image. Other female characters' costumes are even worse. They look like generic historic costumes rented from a warehouse. Had it not been the disappointing women's costumes, I would have given this show a Tis Peak ranking just based on the men's costume. But unfortunately, due to this imbalance, the overall rating drops to the gets the job done tier.
Okay, good. We like to see something getting the job done. Starting to feel a little bit better. How about 1521, the Philippines, with 1521, the quest for love and freedom?
Humabon and Humamay, these are my ancestors. I was born and raised in the same kingdom where they're from. They did not read the historical records about these two. You can look it up, and it's right there. Their descriptions, their clothes, even their physical traits, to the hair. If they're on a budget, there's really no excuse for you not to read the books because they're free. You don't need money to access these books. Enrique de Malacca is a really important historical figure in their history, and I can't believe that they kind of whitewashed him. It's so sad. The Spaniards didn't wear chainmail when they came over here. The Philippines is too hot for that kind of armor, so definitely it's a no. Another missed opportunity to showcase our native hat, this one, depicting Humamay, the queen, with her trademark hat would have been a perfect idea. According to Pigafetta, she never left her house without her hat, and she had several hats. In our traditions, usually the way we would showcase wealth in terms of fabric would be the threads, the material used, also the colors, the dyes that you use. What is this lace up bodycon pageant looking? I don't know what this is. I don't know what this is, and it's nude colored. Diwata is a princess and a seer, and if you're very wealthy, you have all the money to afford all the bling and all the dyes and all the threads and silks, but I mean, the fabric that they're using, really cheap. I hate it. I hate it so much. Our people are very known for our craftsmanship in terms of goldsmithing, and it's so sad that they couldn't, or they just were not willing to showcase that part of our culture. We're among the largest exporters of abaca cloth or abaca fabric. How do they not know what to do with abaca fabric? They're wearing rags. It looks so trashy. It looks like they have a shortage of abaca fabric, which just shows how much Filipinos and even Filipino Americans think that we were uncivilized and unwashed. They're showing us with dirty faces, dirty bodies. It's also very offensive. Her makeup! What is up with eyebrows on fleek? I mean, I don't know what's going on in here. As for the rating, this is a very easy one. This just ain't it. 1521. They took from our history and they just didn't care enough to respect us and respect our people, our traditions. This ain't it. And if there's any, like, a tier lower than this ain't it, I would put it there. I would put it there.
Once again, this ain't it. All right. Okay, we are back to Ming Dynasty China from 1572 to 1620 with Ripe Town.
So Ripe Town is about a murder mystery. It remains quite faithful to Ming Dynasty men's fashion, and the overall costume design is logical and systematic. Okay, let's look closer at the main male character, a constable who wears knee-length upper garments with trousers and a long vest, which is also called zhaojia. This outfit also serves as his uniform. However, similar to Under the Microscope, there is a shared issue. Many male characters don't wear hats. Our main character sometimes do wear a hat, which is great, but sometimes he doesn't. Now, I'm thinking it's a choice that costume designers made to cater to the modern day audience tastes, because we don't like people's hair being covered or something. The female costumes, while more historically accurate than the Microscope show, still lack volume and sleeve length. They also incorporate decorative elements from early Qing Dynasty, which is a later period. If following the Valley era style, the costume should look like this. Additionally, in terms of hairstyles, Ming Dynasty women, unless young girls, wouldn't typically leave their hair down. The hairstyle would be more like this. And lastly, I must mention the overall visual design. Many scenes and frames reflect classical Chinese aesthetics, which work cohesively with the costume design, making the show very pleasant to watch. Despite some flaws, it is still one of the best shows in overall costume design and historic accuracy. I would give this show a tis peak rating.
Ladies and gentlefolk, we have our very first tis peak. I love to see it. I was getting a little bit nervous there for a second. Off to early 17th century Transylvania, to Tündérkert.
Tündérkert.
Thank you, Google Translate.
Tündérkert.
So, with Fairy Garden, oh god, pretty much none of the details make sense within the time period and the region. A lot of the portraits that we see from the time, the women are wearing front-laced gowns with like billowing white sleeves underneath. Versus with a TV show, we have these like ill-fitting bodices, long sleeves. There's a scene where one of the characters is undressing and we can see the metal eyelets. You pretty much get none of the actual Hungarian details. So with women's fashion, very ornate, very colorful. You have a lot of reds, greens. It uses a lot of coral and pearl beads, heavily embroidered. And it just, none of that is here. With the men's fashion as well, I can kind of see the influence of the main character's red jacket. I found a later example closer to the 19th century. Royal men's jackets were called mentees, and they're pretty much directly from Turkish outerwear. It's just a lot wider on the bottom, it's not cut straight. With the main sort of like villainess character, Elizabeth, I have quite a few portraits of her surviving, and she has like this beautiful Piccadilly collar. Not a single character is seen wearing them. Again, why would you leave out such a important historical dress detail? A lot of the women's hair isn't covered and it's just braided up where it's loose. And with unmarried women, they wore a heavily beaded headband called a koroya. And so yeah, it's definitely at this ain't it. There is no historic detail to be seen. There is just absolutely nothing.
Alas. All right, we are heading off to 1627 and 1636-7, once again in Korea with My Dearest.
This is a really still devastating point for Korea. Not even 40 years before this, Korea was also involved in the Imjin Wars with Japan from 1592 to 1598. So Korea has been greatly affected in terms of a great depopulation, as well as just general hardships from a post-war society. I appreciate a toned down, especially for the women's, chima, skirt, and jogori color combinations, where they can obviously do a wide range, but I definitely appreciate a lack of over-embroidery, over-embellishment. Also, in the sort of lack of head covering aspect, I like the nod of them being in a place that is known for a lower enforcement of social norms, allowing genders and different, maybe even social levels to interact on what would not be an encouraged level. These lovely made garments are definitely given with a modern eye, but they are rather plain, and as you move in with a character's storylines, what you can see is a lessening of detail, lessening of embellishment into these beautiful, like rusty colored cholik, which is gorgeous, very inspiring, might make one myself. So it's a really lovely visual that this drama paints, with a lot of work behind textile use in terms of their own color usages, but still being able to entertain audiences. I really hold this one in a very higher regard. So I would say it gets the job done in the best way possible, but they are making some deliberate choices in their costuming.
All right, a nice, solid gets the job done. We are now off to 1609 in Basque Country, Spain, with
Fille du Feu.
The thing with Fille de Feu, excuse all the French pronunciations, the issue with Fille de Feu, it's just overall a lot of jumping around different eras and a very easy and a very practical way of getting the 17th century, beginning of the 17th century. It's just go black. Black is the new black. If you want to make any formal men or any formal, even women, if they were participants of this sober, somber, black, dark trend, so they did that right. It's a very easy reference to pinpoint to the beginning of the 17th century. In the series, they use it to make this contrast between this dark figure that comes to witch hunt with the upper class of this castle, which they dress in very ornate brocades and textiles, suspicious textiles of suspicious origin, probably polyester. I just say they keep pushing the pirate shirt agenda with the loose Regency shirts, fuller sleeves that I have ever seen. And it's something at the end of the day that happens a lot with this. I don't want to say low budget, but with these period dramas and period seasons, some of the decisions, they're just downright bad. They have these women running around in their loose undergarments, but the makeup and the hair, and oh my god, I'm working in the beach, my hair must be down and I might look like a princess, so the bad guy from the witch hunt must like me so I don't get burned in the stake. So there's a lot of styles from that era that they could have referenced or brought into the costume department, especially the headpieces. At the end of the day, there's some pinpoint reference that could indicate a vague vibe of 17th century or beginning of the 17th century. So I would say they tried. Even though there's some examples of styling that are downright bad, very affectionately they tried.
Okay, heading over to 1627 in France, we have the first part. It's a several-part film. The Three Musketeers, the D'Artagnan part. Overall, there are some pretty decent 17th century silhouettes. There is some random head jewelry, which does seem to be a thing in period dramas for some reason. Especially in the beginning of the 17th century, we have these short bodices and large puffy sleeves and these sort of, well, going into the sort of off-the-shoulder look. So we do see some of that in this, which is super great to see. Although I will say the sleeves in this period are cut way back. The arm size reach way deep into the back. And we don't see that in the clothing construction when we see the backs of some of these gowns. But it really does make such a difference in giving you that 17th century posture. The waistlines in this period are high for men and for women. These random background guards are also like kind of great. The king's doublet is pretty good with the high raised waistline. He was one of the doublets where I was like, yeah, that one's actually not so bad. The overall cavalier silhouette is there with the hats and the boots, and you know, this seems to be something that's very popular with the early 17th century, when on the rare occasion we do see it depicted in media. They might have taken it a little bit far by putting absolutely everyone in a cavalier hat, but you know, we'll let it slide because, I mean, cavalier hats are just so great. I love the men's slitted gowns to allow for the swords. I mean, that's very much a period detail. I'm slightly disappointed in the lack of neckwear. We are still very much in ruff territory. So the lack of ruffs, the lack of lace, the lack of collars, especially on some of the nobility and the royalty, is definitely a bit unusual. Obviously, lace was super expensive, and you know, if you had the money for lace, you were absolutely going to show it off. You haven't got your Ferrari, but you've still got your nice, crisp white linens. And then there is Milady, who cares not for historical representation in the slightest. She will be out here in her studded jackets and her layered pirate belts and her goth trash smoky eyes. But it is fine. Eva Green can do whatever she wants. I'm gonna put this in they tried. Yeah, they tried. Same time, same place, same universe. We have the Three Musketeers Milady version, which is the part of the film that came out most recently. Same universe, more Milady, which is good in some respects, not so good in other respects. So the same pretty much still stands for the men. It's decent in some places, a little bit lacking in other places. We have even more high fantasy going on with Milady. High fantasy are like cocktail dresses. Take your pick. I loved this, in particular, this triple row of top stitching on this one man's coat, as though this wouldn't have added like several hours of extra hand sewing labor to this clearly workman's coat in this here pre-sewing machine era. It's fine, probably no one is meant to think this deeply about it, but You know what? Once again, they tried. They tried. So next we are hopping in our TARDIS and time traveling to 1666 in England, where we have an appearance of Isaac Newton in one of the recent specials of Doctor Who. From what we're seeing here, it looks like they're trying to represent a slightly later time period. Mid-17th century fashion gets weird, like in a really great way, but like weird. We're transitioning out of doublets and into longer coats and waistcoats, you know, as becomes the fashion in the 18th century. But in the meantime, we get this like weird short like bolero doublet thing with like puffy shirts sticking out underneath it. We've got petticoat breeches, we've got ribbons absolutely everywhere. I don't think I've ever seen it represented in media because it is just so wild, which is also unfortunate because it's great. So what they're going for here with this long coat, this sort of boxy, baggy, more loosely fitted coat, these wide cuffs, this is definitely more late 17th century / early 18th century. Isaac Newton, wasn't he like not born then? Like he wouldn't have been this young at that period. So like they deliberately hired a young actor to portray him, which means they are going for 1666 because they do make a mention of that as part of the plot point. And yet they've put him in late 17th century / early 18th century dress, which I can understand why they did it aesthetically, because like if they don't want to go like mid 17th century wackiness, like fine, but also like I can't say I'm not disappointed. We do have a portrait of Isaac Newton that does seem to be in the silhouette that they're going for, and this is actually possibly what they referenced when they were referencing, you know, for the costume material for this. They looked at that portrait and they saw, okay, we're going to put him in this, but Isaac Newton in that portrait is a lot older than he is now, than he was in 1666. I can see what they were trying to do, but they didn't quite, you know, go for the logic of timeline. So they tried. They tried. You can see they like looked at a portrait, didn't necessarily look at the right portrait. Okay, next we are headed to 1670 Poland with the series 1670.
It's mostly a satire, so I'm not also gonna take the costumes too seriously. But it does do a good job in making it look historical and area appropriate. Since we see the people in warmer clothing, it's not just like flowing linen and whatnot. The clothes do look practical, but not really a whole lot of detail that's accurate. For example, our main guy, in the late 17th century, a really important part of royal wear is the cantouche sash, which, you know, sort of signifies status. So it's a larger lace strip of fabric that's tied around the waist. Again, very, very popular starting from the late 17th century, which this takes place on. I do like the fact that the clothing is layered, but it just looks like they dressed the village people in rags and the royal people in whatever historical looking clothing that sort of made sense to the period. It's kind of all over the place, but I'm gonna give it they tried. It doesn't have that much historical detail, but the small things that it does have, it does well.
Okay, so next up we have a flashback to 1861 Scotland in an episode of The Mayfair Witches. It's episodes 6 and 7. Time travel? Mind projection? Time? Something. We have definitely fallen into the trope here of everyone in rural history looks like they've been dragged through a hedge for some reason, as if people like didn't know how to keep themselves clean. Okay, people in history and people even living in the countryside in the 17th century, like I promise, did know how to clean themselves and they did know how to clean their clothes. But like for vibes, I guess like, okay, everyone's a little bit grimy. I'm not quite sure what this dress is. Theoretically, it could be a chemise if she wasn't wearing something else underneath it already, which is a bit confusing. It sort of, in a way, resembles a like 14th century gown, not quite the period. We do have some metal grommets, which I will let slide because this actually might be on some type of leather, which like is acceptable, but we're not doing metal grommets on anything else in this period. The silhouette of the witch hunter is pretty good, like pretty 17th century. We do have plenty of evidence of that, so like solid that they got that right. I do love that they've given this villager a stomacher with her bodice pinned on over it. It doesn't really fit her that well, but that is actually fine narratively because she's probably inherited it from someone else. I want to put this in either very low, it gets the job done, or high, they tried. I'm going to put this in a high, they tried. Next off, we are off to the ocean in the early 18th century with Our Flag Means Death. I think we all know where this is going, but just for funsies. Okay, so the coats on the naval officers are not bad. They definitely communicate that early 17th century style with the wide cuffs. This is like quintessential like pirate era. And like this is when we see a lot of like pirate clothes and pirate coats, it's usually early 17th century dress, which they've got. Like fine, great, cool. Literally nothing about anyone else is period though. They are a big proponent of random leather. They are a big proponent of corset waist-cinch things, of vambraces, arm brace. Like, why? Why? Literally all of Blackbeard. But like, we know this. We know all of this. It's not trying to be historical. It is its own world, its own thing. This is very much a design choice. So next we are off to South Korea, 300 years ago, which puts us roughly in the 18th century with Destined With You.
Now this one, there are easy depictions, quite easy as we're staying with a Yangban class. Within a person's household, they were allowed to even take down their hair. Men would also have the option of wearing something called a jeonjeogwan, which would be another horsehair hat, as shown in the drama. Koreans loved hats, we loved hats for occasions. That being said, the heroine of the historic side of this drama as it switches from modern day to a historic Joseon. As I mentioned in terms of men's hairstyles, women's hairstyles was also a very, 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 very strong convention. To see untamed, unbraided hair, that would be a societal shun-worthy no, no, no. A lot of these winter shots are shown by both male and female characters in very not winter ensembles. Silk gauze has no place in winter, unless you're me, now, in 2023. Even winter archery outfits. Wear your hats. Your hat matched the garment. Your hat was respect to Confucian principles. It's a choice. Crimson skirts, red skirts would have been definitely common, but as well the use of indigo dye, jok being a plant native to Korea, but also indigo by way of India, China, into Korea was also a really coveted color throughout all classes. So seeing sort of different shades of blue in these dramas in Joseon period is pretty accurate, as well as color restriction for women. Even as married women, you would wear different colors. If you had a son, you would wear different colors. So Jung's mother outside with her jango, it is a very specific, really spot-on, accurate depiction, easily reading everything about who this person is. As usual, all black military ensembles. It's a very modern Korean aesthetic. There are some almost K-pop, aesthetically pleasing, strong, studded shoulder, sort of a lot of things not stacking up. But I would have to say they tried.
They tried. So Tom Jones is a title set in 1740s in England. So the silhouettes in this are pretty good. We've got some really great construction details in this. This sleeve looks like it was set completely in the 18th century way, which is really cool. We do see a ton of modern sleeve setting in period dramas just ubiquitously. And here it looks like we actually have the period sleeve method. The sleeve is pleated and not gathered, which is super fun to see. I love how the men's coats in the flashbacks adhere to early 18th century men's coat dress in the length and the cuff width. Again, we are in this early 18th century period where the coats are very wide, the cuffs are very wide, they're not quite as fitted as they've become in the later century going into the Regency period. Most of the lace that we see in this looks very 19th century. Some of the fabrics are completely modern. This feather pattern, I have never seen anything like this on extant garments. Mostly we're dealing in stripes and like a very specific graphic representation of florals that is not this. There's some great examples of stays, and some stays with spiral lacing, which is super exciting. A lot of period dramas just cross-lace everything, which is a very 19th century thing. So it's one lace that goes in a spiral rather than, two ends that sort of cross over each other. I don't think I'd ever seen a back-closing 18th century dress, so this is definitely unusual, especially for the amount of back-closing gowns we're seeing. Wouldn't have been this common. Too many back-closing gowns for my liking here. We have child stays, which is really cool to see. Yes, children were wearing stays. No, they were not tight-laced, etc., etc. Hannah Waddingham sticks out like a sore thumb. She is just egregiously modernly made up. I cannot unsee her as a time traveler. I apologize if you're trying to watch this now and trying to not see her as a time traveler, but that's all I can see. She just looks like she's just been transplanted from the 21st century. Other than that, it gets the job done. The silhouettes are pretty good. The choices are pretty good. It gets the job done. So next up in 1743 France, we have Jeanne du Barry.
Jeanne du Barry.
That was close. For the most part, I thought the clothes were pretty good in this. There is clearly a pastel color palette going on, especially for the background characters. This is obviously an artistic choice made by the film, because historically there was plenty of bold color. We could get really fantastic bright bold colors with the natural dyes that they were using in this period. We don't have to be pastel, but for artistic reasons, fine. The clothes are a bit stylized in general, but the silhouettes and the fits of the gown and the coats they're pretty good. They made some genuine effort with the hair and makeup overall. The background especially was really impressive, so I appreciate the effort. And then we have Jeanne, our leading lady. You know that basic costume design technique of putting your lead in bright red against everyone else in paler washed out colors so that the lead just stands out intensely? It's kind of like this did that, but with clothing everyone in really nice historical dress and then having the lead stand out by having her in egregiously modern dress, which is definitely a choice. She's got some Lana Del Rey core thing going on. Sad Tumblr girl hairstyles. At one point she wears a bridal gown. She wears a quinceañera dress. There's a Chanel bolero at one point, which was not ever something I have seen in the 1740s, let alone the 18th century as a whole. And of course there are copious examples of corsets without chemises, which just makes my blood boil. This woman doesn't just look like she knows what an iPhone is. This is a woman who fully works at BuzzFeed, has a fashion blog, and meets her besties for bottomless mimosa brunch in Midtown on Sundays. The crowd really gets the job done. The crowd is great. The lead ain't it. Where do I put this? Just know, they tried, but the crowd is good, but the lead ain't it. So next up we are off to the 1760s in New Yorkshire with the Gallows Pole. On surface level, when you look at this show, it does look pretty good. The silhouettes are, for the most part, there, but I feel the longer you look at the details, the more you just go, For a show about textiles, I have to say the fabrics do look good. Some of the details, not so much. I'm kind of disappointed in the lack of color. It is possible to get bright colors with natural dyes. Grace has some really nice colorful peasant wear, but this is probably more for meta reasons, so I've got to make the leading actress stand out. I am a bit about some of the hairstyles, mainly the little milkmaid braids. I have not seen that historically. I have definitely not seen this mullet. That's very modern. We have a great example of some 18th century shoulder seams. It's got this dropped shoulder, this very smooth shoulder on the men's coat. So the seam is really smoothed into the curve of that seam. It's dropped off the shoulder. We've got no puffing or definition in between the sleeve and the shoulder, which is just so great to see. We've got some stays as outerwear. We do have excellent examples of some cross-lacing happening at the little top slit that's used just for size adjustment up here. Not really for stays that fully close down the front or that are lacing up fully on the back. But, I have seen an excellent example of a little, short lacing gap at the top. So I will accept that, but everything else in this show is cross-laced, which is not a thing. Spiral lacing is the main way we are closing our stays in this period. So I'm gonna say it gets the job done. At first glance, it gets the job done. And then, the longer you look at it, the more you're wait. So just don't look too closely. Next we have The Great Season 3, which takes us to 1760s Russia.
I really like Catherine's dress that she wears in one of the episodes that is made from toile de jour fabric. The designs on the fabric are inspired by etchings made by Russian and foreign artists who were traveling in and working in Russia and making these ethnographic depictions of peasants and architecture. And there are very specific ones that they've referenced in the print of the dress. Anyways, the other costumes that I really appreciated were costumes that Peter and Catherine wear in episode 4 that are not historically accurate and they're very fantastical, but are clearly referencing some costumes that were worn by the Romanov family and the Russian aristocrats for the 1903 costume ball, where the dress code was 16th and 17th century Russian nobility. Some of the overcoats that Peter and other characters are wearing that are trimmed with fur on the cuffs and on the lapels reference a particular style that was popular in like early 18th to mid 18th century in Russia. Catherine herself was not Russian, she was German. She has to balance between these two identities as a foreigner, but also she has to create an image of herself of a ruler of Russia. My biggest problem is that the fabrics and embroidery, I feel like there was a kind of lack of goldwork embroidery that was so popular in that time period. But again, some of the textiles were incredible, like this toile de jour Russian style. There is some hand embroidery and quite a lot of nice fabrics overall that give the feeling of the era. In terms of the rankings, I would probably put it in it gets the job done, and just because of the references to all of the small little details that shows that there had been incredible research done.
I'm going to put this as high, it gets the job done. So we have season 7, part 1 of Outlander, which takes place in the 1770s on the US East Coast. I know we've been a bit up and down with Outlander in the past, mostly down in recent eras, but I have to say I was really, really genuinely impressed. We have actually got all of the women in stays this time with chemises, which, like, honestly, could I have asked for more. Claire specifically is wearing a pair of half-bone stays, which are a nice lighter alternative to fully bone stays, and is also really common for this period, so I love that for her. Rachel's silhouette is especially really well done. The construction of the back of this gown is really wonderful, with those shoulder seams set really far back. She's even wearing a spiral-laced bodice later on in this series, which I just love to see. For the men, we have back-lacing waistcoats and this style of cutting them a little bit shorter in the back to conserve on fabric, which is absolutely something that happened in this period. They would normally be covered by the coat in the back, so you didn't have to use all that fabric making the fashionable long waistcoat. Such a good detail. Claire has the occasional anachronism with what seems to be, this maybe looks like a 20th century coat, and a couple of suspicious belts, but honestly, she gets a pass for being a time traveler. Like, fine, fair enough. You know, it's something that was done in the 20th century, and it's absolutely something that she could have done, taking an 18th century belt and wearing it in this 20th century fashion that, you know, she might be used to, but that people in this period aren't quite doing yet. So that's fine, that is absolutely fair enough. These details don't actually pull me out of the 18th century world. I have spoken a bit about the sort of art of making decisions for character or narrative reasons that make sense within the period, and I love to see them doing that in this, which is so cool. Claire here opts for men's waistcoats and men's shirts because, I don't know, maybe she's more comfortable in that. It's slightly more similar to 20th century dress than what the 18th century women are wearing, so like absolutely fair enough, great. I'm gonna say this very solidly gets the job done. I'm very proud of Outlander this season. They really did a good job with this one. So next we have the film Chevalier, which takes place in 1770s France. Considering that the designer had something stupid like 6 weeks to get all of these costumes done, to get this whole film designed, what they have achieved is absolutely unbelievable. This is an absolute feat. The silhouettes and the fits are just 10 out of 10. The men's wigs alone, 'tis peak. You can tell they're actually properly powdered wigs. They are not just gray or white hair, but they are actual, you know, like hair that you would get powdered to get that faded sort of grayish look, which is what a lot of modern reproductions of 18th century wigs are trying to go for, but not quite doing that. They are actually powdering the wigs in this film, and it brings me so much joy. The variety of dress style, it's not all just robe à l'anglaise, which is great. We've got some nice retroussé gowns. We've got caraco jackets on the Chevalier's mother. This jacket she wears later with the ribbons down the front is like straight out of a museum. We are missing some embroidery. This was a conscious choice by the designer to have no embroidery because the timeline on this film was so small. But, you know, opting instead for no embroidery over embroidery that would have been hastily done by machine and wouldn't have looked right, you know, that's a fair compensation that has to be made. So the one thing that bumps this down from absolutely to his peak is some of the women's hair and makeup is definitely a modern stylistic choice. Is there a reason for it? Hair and makeup and costume are like two completely different departments, and like sometimes to achieve the Tiz peak you have to work together on that, but like sometimes someone's going for another look. But like it's so unfortunate because the clothes are really, really pretty solid in this, but the hair and makeup, it's completely modern, which is so unfortunate. I'm gonna give this a it gets the job done, but like really, really highly commendably it gets the job done. Next we have Queen Charlotte, the Bridgerton spin-off series, which takes place in the late 18th century in England. Once again, this is like the Bridgerton cinematic universe. This is some, you know, fantastical version of the early 19th century and alternate universe England. So I have to say the costumes are beautifully, beautifully made. The silhouettes are actually like really good for the late 18th century. They really nailed the fits. Even if some of the arms are cut a bit modern on the men's coats. I mean, that's just honestly to be expected at this point. I'm like impressed when they do cut the arm size period correct, but like if they don't, it's like, yeah, that's just normal. So that being said, in keeping with the Bridgerton cinematic universe, most of the fabrics and the trimmings are completely modern. They are opting for bling and spectacle over historical component to these materials, but that's just part of the world. It's a fantasy world. They've done really genuinely good research on silhouette. I'm very impressed, but you know, it is going its own way from there. So this is it's a design choice. So next we have, keeping in the Regency period, we have season 3 of Sanditon, which takes place in Regency England. Once again, we have really generally good silhouettes and details. I love getting to see the really unique men's collars for this period. The fashion is for really, really high collars that brush the jawline, so they are sort of cut away at the front to have room for the chin. So I love to see that. There are some great examples of Regency dress. For example, this one with the super high bust line, alongside some not so great examples. As usual, many of the greatest pieces are on background characters, but you know, that is how things are. The background tend to be rented from costume houses, from other productions that have built Regency gowns and can often, you know, build them to more historical standard versus the leads, which are subject to artistic visions and tend to end up very non-historical, whereas background characters look fantastic. Denim is really interesting. They've put her in older 18th century style gowns, some of which are traditional 18th century gowns, probably, you know, in the world left over from the previous century, but others clearly have shorter waistlines. They're built sort of in 18th century styles, but with shorter waistlines, more in fashion with the Regency styles. And this is actually totally believable that she's more set in past styles, and that is how she likes her dresses made. That's how she has her dressmaker try and recreate these styles that she's very comfortable in. There's some real attention to detail and construction. We've got some top stitching done by hand here, lots of it actually, which is really great to see. The hair and makeup is where it really starts to falter a bit, as usual, as is to be expected. We have absolutely no Regency curls, which again could very well have been a directorial imposition of the director saying, I hate those Regency curls, we're not doing that in this show, and the hair designer's just going like, how can you do a Regency show with no Regency curls? It's unfortunate despite, you know, how hard the clothes may be trying. Charlotte's eyebrows, like this is one of the things that I could not unsee the whole time. Time traveler vibes. She's got those eyebrows that are just filled in to a completely modern aesthetic shape. And then of course they like give up on her hair like halfway through. The clothes are good. You know what? The clothes are good. I'm gonna say this gets the job done. Despite its shortcomings, it does get the job done. Sticking to our Regency England setting, we have Perdita. There is really very little historically representative here, except for maybe the vague suggestion of the Regency era from the height of the men's collars and the fact that they are wearing cravats. and the women's waistlines. Like those three things like say, we are in the Regency period. It's like a title card on screen. Sophia shows up to a ball in a crinoline and something sort of suggestive of 18th century stays. She is from the 21st century, but time travels back to, we think, the Regency period to indulge her fascination with Jane Austen characters. The source material has her traveling back to the 1830s, but like, they're giving us no 1830s whatsoever otherwise, so question mark. Some of the silhouettes are not bad. There is a nice Spencer jacket showing some variety, which is fine. We've got another Chanel style jacket apparently. I appreciate the not over exaggerated tight lacing scene, but again, we would not have metal eyelets yet. And of course, we are not cross-lacing in this period, so appreciate the sentiment, but not quite. The hair and makeup is all completely modern. I have to give this, like the clothes ain't it, like not in a like an offensive, like a wholly offensive way, but like no, it ain't it. It's really not. So next we have, in 1800s France, we have a film about Napoleon.
Luckily, because I know exactly what happens in his life and what goes on, it's easier for me to follow. This is the main bit of feedback I've had from people that don't necessarily know about the history, where they felt themselves a little lost and everything. Now, throughout the film, costume-wise, nothing actually jumps out at me as being glaringly wrong. The film does, however, suffer from the crime of the blue filter, which takes away some of the vibrancy, which is there, because I've seen behind-the-scenes shots, as well as a couple of friends of mine made some of the costumes and things, so I have sneaky photos. But all in terms of the colour is there, the brightness is there, the costumes are really good. Now, the only thing in regards to Napoleon's uniforms that really bugs me is to do with fibre content for one, and the way the shoulders sit. But nothing gets that right anyway. What I particularly love is the way they dress Josephine, because that's a really, really difficult character, because history hasn't been kind to her, mainly because she was a huge fashionista, had a huge clothing budget, and she basically was the fashion icon of her day. The Empire line waist for her goes up and down a bit, where it should be slightly higher at points or lower at points, but that is nitpicking, which you're only going to know if you really know the period. Walking around wearing this, every time someone calls me Napoleon, the nation of the French gets slightly meaner. And they're like, Napoleon, it's like, this is not Napoleon. This is the Windsor uniform. You couldn't be any more anti-Napoleon. This is a British royal uniform. Napoleon is like this and a very different shape. This is just, I'm jaunty. I don't think that there's anyone else in history who can be as summed up just from the silhouette of one piece of clothing. Why couldn't they actually get the hat right in the film? T. So in terms of costuming, not Tis peak, because there'd be a little things I'd like to do, but really gets the job done.
So now It Gets the Job Done is actually beating out They Tried, which is still beating out This Ain't It. So, okay, I'm feeling a lot better about our situation this year. Next up, we have in 1860, Sicily, the Lions of Sicily. So episode 1 is set roughly 10-ish years before the rest of the series. We have some really great 50s and 60s dresses on the ladies, which we love to see. The men are showing a very odd affinity for sort of Regency through 1820s coats. Most of the coats we're seeing in the show are cropped short, which is very unusual outside of evening and riding coats for the middle of the 19th century. This one in particular has that very unique 1820s puff sleeve, which is very unusual for this period. The men's coats of this period are starting to head into the more boxy era of the sort of 70s and 80s of 19th century menswear, where the coats are relatively long and sort of square. We don't see that at all here. Personally, I'm all for incorporating older costume styles because it's unrealistic for fashion to just change automatically at the drop of the ball on New Year's Eve. But the fact that most of these men are seen in like 30 to 40-year-old fashion suggests that this was possibly either a lack of research or perhaps a deliberate disregard of the historical reality for aesthetic reasons. I'm not quite sure what that aesthetic reason is. We do have one woman in a Regency dress, which was unusual. The clothes aren't bad, and it's not without the realm of possibility that people could have obtained these clothes. I just question whether these would have been the most common choices. I want to put this like somewhere between It Gets the Job Done and They Tried. It gets the job done if I'm being very generous. I'm gonna just put it right there. Next up we have from the late 18th century up through about 1816, Shaka Ilembe.
So the story of like Shaka's reign and his like rise to power, it's like a very common sort of tale in like our history as a country, but I think this is like the first time we've ever really seen it done to this kind of scale, with this much production and the acting and the effects and everything, and you really see how much effort really went into the costumes. So a big foundation to the wardrobe of like Zulu people in this time would have been primarily like animal hides, which you see a lot of, and I really appreciate you'll see on everyone who's got a very high ranking in society, so the kings, the royalty, generals, they wear a lot of leopard hide. So they wear the like arm coverings, they wear the mbesho, which is like an apron on the back that covers like their buttocks, and then this is usually made out of cowhide. They also have a front kilt, and this could be made out of like monkey tails or leopard tails. They did a really good job of keeping to a lot of the like traditional materials. A lot of that stuff's not very easy to find, and a lot of people who make that stuff are not very easy to find or don't exist in as much of a quantity anymore. They've really done their best to shy away from any sort of like synthetic materials, from woven cloths. Another really great thing I think they did is that they didn't shy away from the nudity that would have been in the time period. Majority of them, unless they were married, would have spent a lot of their time with a lot of skin out. Breasts and even like buttocks to a certain extent weren't like really sexualized parts of the body. They are kind of like basically like an elbow in this sort of consideration. So a very normal thing is for most young people, you really wouldn't wear any sort of coverings over these areas until you were married, or maybe if you joined like the army or the military. The female characters that are actually covered up are the married ones. So that's sort of a thing that comes on with marriage and age. You would start to cover yourself up with certain cloths. So they would wear different like cow hides around their necks. And then they would also start wearing different headdresses. So these are called iskolo, which is a headdress married women wear. All kinds of feathers, depending obviously on like your rank. And you see some really beautiful like elongated ones. I think Queen Nandi wears a really amazing one. It's a bit tricky with like a lot of early Southern African stuff because there's not a huge amount of like historical record or like primary sources. There's not a lot of extant examples you could easily access. So a lot of the stuff you do take from like oral history, or you just take from existing cultural traditions. And yeah, and I would 100% rate this like totally to its peak. They've really done an excellent job. They've shown really great respect to the traditions of the cultures. They're also making everyone look really fabulous.
Oh, that is so satisfying. I love at his peak. Next up we have The Confessions of Franny Langton, which takes place in 1826, both in London as well as some flashbacks to Jamaica.
Something that has defined Jamaican dress was the fact that it's coming from European style. Obviously it started off with slavery. Essentially your clothing would be given to you by your master. So one of the great ways of homogenizing the peoples was taking away their distinct cultural signifiers, and of course dress is just it's a visual language which is being taken away. So what we have here is a working woman, but one of the things to note is this is good quality clothing comparatively. So this would say that the lady is working domestically. People outside, their clothing was a lot rougher and there was less chance to have it repaired or replaced. Whereas if you're working in the house, you are reflecting the household. So it would be neat, it would be simple, and it would be clean. And so what this woman is wearing here very much reflects her status within the house and in society. She does have a head wrap as well. Again, this was a carryover from pre-colonial days for the African diaspora. It was also practical, it helped keep your hair under control. It was a little signifier of where you came from, I think, as well. So it was an important aspect of this newer culture that was being developed in the Caribbean. The waist of the dress would be very high up, almost directly underneath the breasts. So it was a very natural, very flowing outline, which is what this lady here reflects. There is a little bit, I think, here and there, but overall, very well done, that part. A bit later on in the Confessions of Franny Langton, when she's grown up, and this would have been the 1820s. Now, This is where things go a bit nuts. First and foremost is the classic trope of having an upper class woman has her hair just out and about. Did not happen in the 1810s, would not happen in the 1810s. This is what would happen if maybe your husband had been keeping you in a tower for the last 6 or 7 years and you escaped. Meanwhile, we have Hepzibah, who is just showing how it's supposed to be done. Her outfit is pure 1820s. So we have this ruff, and her dress, it's got the puffier sleeves at the top. So again, at the beginning of the decade, the puffs weren't as extensive, but they were starting. So her outfit is spot on, it's peak. Her hair as well, she's got these tight, extensive curls on the side, close to the head. Absolutely spot on. They're also wearing Spencer jackets. Now, this is the 1820s. Spencer jackets were everywhere in the 1810s. It was a big thing. But this is the 20s, and this is an upper class setting. And these are supposed to be fashionable women. Fashionable woman is not wearing something a year out of date. And they're certainly not going to be wearing something 3 or 4 years out of date. So, no good at all. We've got a historical figure, Aluda. He was an anti-slavery campaigner. He is fairly close to being peak, except that he does not appear to be wearing a corset. Men wore corsets. It was something that all classes wore. It was very supportive, and I think in terms of what it offered, and it certainly wasn't this sort of desperately agonizing, constricting, monstrous thing that was put upon women. Men wore corsets too. A lot of people find it quite good for the support of the back. They don't have it here, and that really ruins the silhouette for me. 1820s was a great time. Everything was about the waist, and the silhouette would start off with these broad, sloping shoulders, but the trousers were amazing. The trousers would start off with just these big, childbearing hips that come out, they'd be pleating. You don't have anything like that today. You haven't had anything like that since. This was the age of the extravagant dandy. The 1830s is ripe for a fantasy setting. It's got the colours, it's got the wacky hairstyles, particularly for the women. It is just incredibly extreme. Huge shoulders, tiny waists, massive hips, on men and women. If you want to have a fantasy, 1830s is the place to go. Yeah, I would say it's a mix between They Tried and Gets the Job Done. I had to decide between two of them. Gets the job done. They could have done a bit further, I think, and they could have had a lot more fun.
Next up, we have Season 2, Episode 3 of Good Omens, which involves a flashback to Edinburgh, November the 10th, 1827. So I was extremely impressed with this. The silhouettes are great. They've got those fantastic, quintessential 1820s puffed shoulders on Crowley. This was a very high fashion thing and a very sort of new fashion thing. It makes absolute sense that Crowley would be going for this really new sort of ostentatious fashion in menswear, and Aziraphale's sticking with the more classic greatcoat that's been around for a couple of decades by this point. They have absolutely committed to the men's hair of this period, the late 20s going into the 30s, for men and women. It's just spectacular. It's a great period for hair. But they've got the fluff, they've got the sculpture, especially once again on Crowley, who is just rolling with these outlandish fashion styles. Crowley, I imagine, would just slay the 1830s. I mean, we can already see he is going to. They've got the mutton chops, love it. They've got the little M-notch lapels, which was a big thing during this period. So we've got fall front breeches happening on Aziraphale, we can see. Which again is the period correct way to be closing your trousers at this point. I love that they gave Crowley some slightly more period glasses for this period. I do question where their corsets are, or at least for Crowley. Men's corsetry was a huge thing at this period. The ideal silhouette was for this nice, like open, rounded, broad chest sliding into this tiny little waist for the men, and high fashion men, especially men that sort of subscribe to this very ostentatious high fashion for men, which Crowley is appearing to do in the show, would have been wearing a corset. I would have loved to see Crowley embracing that corseted look. I absolutely believe he would have. There are only like 4 costumes in this, so I hesitate to give it a Tis Peak because like they didn't have to like do that much work for this, but like I don't have any criticism. I'm gonna give it a Tis Peak. Fine, it was Tis Peak. Fine, great. Next up in 1830s London, we have Dodger. The costuming in this is kind of a hodgepodge. I think that is the point, because these people are sort of making their living on the streets and getting clothing wherever they can find their clothing, so they're sort of picking and choosing things from different places and wearing what they have and not necessarily adhering to any social customs or here's what's fashionable. So I accept the hodgepodge. We've got some Regency gowns going on. We've got an 18th century caraco jacket happening. These, I mean, they're out of period technically, but they're garments that, you know, could have been found in this period. These sorts of like several decade old garments absolutely would have been around for them to be wearing in the 1830s. It doesn't really explain the forward anachronisms though. I will accept the backdating, but I can't quite get around the forward time traveling. Minnie's very modern hair is done with a curling iron, which we don't really have electric curling irons at this point. The gallery worker is wearing sort of a 40s/50s gown. So there are some sort of curiosities here, but for the most part, it gets the job done. It's a bit unusual, you know, period-wise, but it feels like something that could have been done within the period, so I'm gonna say it gets the job done. Next we have the 1830s set in a fictional town in Denmark, Erengard, the Art of Seduction. So this is a bit of a mix. Generally we have some good 1830s silhouettes. We've got those large sleeves, which is quintessential to the 1830s. There's an interesting story told with some of the super short puffy sleeves, which is more fashionable towards the 1820s and would sort of have been more either, you know, sliding out of fashion or would be viewed as more traditional in a sense. Versus, of course, the growing size and the sleeve starting to drop off the shoulder, which is fashionable in the 1830s going into the 40s. The sleeves are not overstuffed like pillows, which I love to see. They're left nice and airy and puffy, which is how they were done historically. It is a very common mistake these days in period drama costuming to overstuff the sleeves and make them a little bit more ridiculous than they would have been historically. I want to say the Grand Duchess is best dressed generally. Her hair is absolutely on point. It's fantastic to see. Naturally, of course, Erengard, our lead, is the worst dressed. She looks completely modern. Her hair was definitely curled with an electric curling iron. I definitely get the sense that she is a time traveler. She knows what an iPhone is. We have, of course, the occasional instance of improper foundations, which of course results in a fit that is not quite right to the period. I mean, you can get a dress to fit, but you can't get it to have the silhouette, the period figure. So I'm gonna say, like, they overall did a pretty good job, especially with a lot of the other characters. I'm gonna give it like a high they tried. So The Little Mermaid takes place in the 1830s and is set around the Caribbean.
I know it's mostly a fantasy-based film, so they're taking a lot of liberties here. We have Ariel, and she is really just wearing a fantasy outfit. I don't think this has anything to do with the 1830s at all. So from the silhouette, the styling, and all the fabrics used, they're all kind of all over the place. Particularly for women's clothing. The fabrics were crazy, the colours were crazy, everything was nuts. So here we don't have any of that. The colours are quite pale, which is a shame, because colours were becoming a lot more saturated. She's wearing a corset over the clothes, which most countries did not do, particularly in Europe, Western Europe anyway. I know Eastern Europe, I think there was some of that, but certainly not here. I think this is a pretty decent go. Because of the slavery period, there wasn't a lot of traditional clothing. It was all based on European outfits. You can just see some evidence of the puffy sleeve, which we have here. There is some patterning there. Overall pretty decent. They also have a headscarf, which is one of the few differentiations you would get from typical Western clothing for the Caribbean. It's a lovely little touch that they kept. Some of the things are okay, and some of them are gibberish. So a lot of the outfits here, they don't make a lot of sense. They don't have contemporary silhouettes, fabrics, stylings. It is very much fantasy. One of the gentlemen appears to be twerking, because twerking was huge in the 1820s and into the 1830s. The main prince character, his look is okay. It's not bad. It's got the right colours, it's got the right shaping. To be honest, I think overall it's a bit anachronistic, his outfit. It's a bit more 1810s, bordering on the 1800s in terms of styling. He's got his breeches, which typically wouldn't have been day wear, and they would be evening wear, but this is an island setting. The clothing's a lot less formalised. Everything else, though, ain't it. Absolutely not. Absolute gibberish. So this is nothing to do with the 1830s, her gown. The shape of it is all wrong. There's not a lot of shoulder. Through most of the 19th century, evening gowns tended to show off the shoulder, where again, they just had these huge sleeves. They were just massively puffed. And the fabric, I'm not really sure about it. It seems to be sort of a very modern, plasticky fabric that they've got going on there. Historically, no good. Overall, they tried. God bless them.
So Jamaica's scenes are Tiz peak. London gets the job done. So I'm gonna give this a little halfway. Next, we have, of course, this year's crop of Empress Elizabeth of Austria picks. One title, Sisi I, set between the 1830s and 50s in Austria. So I know I should put this one in, it was a design choice, clearly, because they are not going for history whatsoever here. Even the title promo image, we were just confused as to whether or not we had got the right adaptation and whether or not this actually qualified to be on this ranking because it looks completely modern. But no, it is intended to theoretically be a period piece. Most of these clothes look like pieces of modern art. They are interesting, they're fascinating, they're very artistic. They're definitely doing lots of fun riffs off of historical elements, but like, it's riffs off of everything and nothing. It doesn't really make sense with the period that they're trying to represent. They've got people wearing ruffs, which, I mean, I love a good ruff, but like, what has that got to do with the 1860s? By the 1860s, it's kind of irrelevant, so like, why is this an item that is being sort of played with artistically within, you know, this sort of fantasized representation of period dress? Like, it was a design choice. Yes, they're clearly not going for history, they're clearly going for something else, but also there is a deliberate ignoring of history, which is kind of annoying me a little bit. Well, I can't say they tried because they didn't, but it also, like, I can't say it ain't it because clearly they are not trying to represent history here. I'm gonna say, like, I'm gonna give this like a between this ain't it and it was a design choice. Next, we have The Doll Factory, which is set in 1850 in London. This show is probably trying to excuse itself because most of it is shot in the dark, so I cannot see many of the details. They're probably getting away with a lot of costume sins that we are just simply unable to recognize, such as this fact that he might be wearing a button-down shirt here. I see you, I see what you're trying to do here. There are some really great 50s dresses in here. The fit is great, the sleeve details are great, but then for some reason we occasionally go very 1890s on some of these characters. We've got those big puffy 90s sleeves, which is not a thing in the 1850s. Any fullness that we do see in 1850 sleeves is kept below the shoulder, so that's a bit unusual. I will accept some of the hair down representation here since we are dealing with pre-Raphaelite muses, although that we see in the paintings is an artistic representation and not reflective of the hairstyles that were actually being worn by women in this period. I can see what they're trying to do artistically with that, so like I will give them a pass on this one occasion. I'm gonna say this gets the job done. Next up we have season 2 of the series Sisi, which once again is centered on Empress Elizabeth of Austria, which means we are in the 1850s in Austria. So there seems to be a theme with all Sisi media, apparently, that they are going to make it a design choice. At least this one seems to be taking a little bit more inspiration from the source history and plays more with 1850s silhouettes, albeit incorporating some modern fashion elements and making things up in modern fabrics, which seems to be, again, a theme with a lot of these Empress Elizabeth pieces. There was this one dress that bordered almost on 1950s couture, which was a bit curious. I guess that is a risk of trying to extrapolate too much from history, is that it can end up accidentally, in some cases, end up looking like another period that also was trying to emulate this period. Like, for example, when the Regency period starts to take inspiration from 16th century ruffs. You know, if a ruff is not necessarily done right, it could look more Regency than 16th century. Honestly though, even if it is artistic, they're all taking the same artistic liberties. Yeah, this goes in design choice. That's pretty solid. Next up, we have Gold Diggers, which is set in 1853 in Australia. This is the early crinoline period where we are starting to get the big crinoline skirts very soon. It's a nice opportunity for differentiation between the high fashion characters versus the ones who haven't caught on to that fashion yet. I was very impressed with this backlacing gown until I spotted what very much looks to be a side zip, which is not historically correct. The other two sisters are inexplicably like 18th century cottagecore for some reason. However, they have barely any structure in their bodices, which would not have been a thing in the 18th century. In this case, though, it's not like they haven't caught up with the fashion, like, you know, they haven't caught up with the crinoline and they're still sort of stuck in the 1830s or 40s. They're an entire century out of date. They do get some new dresses at one point, which silhouette-wise is not bad. They are a bit stylized, but, you know, we'll give them the silhouette. Then, of course, we commit the cardinal sin of corsets against bare skin. These corsets very much look like modern mass-produced corsets that cannot be comfortable, especially when worn directly next to the skin. I really do pity these actors. This one has like 2 bones in it. It gives absolutely no structure, barely any shape. Like, it does nothing for her. It just squeezes her, which must be horribly uncomfortable. It comes way up over the bust, which corsets of this time period really only came up about halfway, so you could, you know, like breathe. Bust improvers were a thing during this period. They were not, however, made of pastry. They were not croissants. But, you know, I enjoy the sentiment. Tippy, Siobhan, and Mona are really the only ones sort of decently dressed, and they're basically background characters. I'm gonna say this one ain't it. Next up, we have an adaptation of Great Expectations, which takes place in 1860s in England. So I was pretty impressed with this. They've got some amazing tailoring details. The back seams on this coat are very appropriate to the first half of the 19th century period. I love a good example of a corded corset. This was the primary style of corsetry in the early 19th century. It was very soft and very light. This would have probably been a little bit sort of backdated. By the 1860s, we are starting to use more whalebone and going into the steel use as the cut of these corsets start to get really innovative. But that is okay, because there is obviously a theme of outdatedness, especially within the Havisham household. That perfectly makes sense narratively. Miss Havisham is absolutely stuck in the Regency period, and that is like a main point of her character, and by default she's got Estella sort of sticking to that as well. Estella is dressed more 1820s and 30s, which is a bit later, but, you know, still very outdated for this period, and that is, you know, a feature of her character in the book as well, is that, you know, her gowns are too short for the 1860s. This one doesn't fit her properly and probably isn't hers, which again, it makes sense narratively. Estella rocks some absolutely epic 1830s hair, which again makes sense for her character and for her world. Not, it should be noted, 1860s fashions, but for her this makes sense. Biddy has a lovely subdued 1830s / early 40s style dress with dropped shoulders and unsupported sleeves, which is great. Pip gets his $6 suit, which is clearly in an 1820s, early 1830s style with the puffed shoulders. So it is not a fashionable suit, but, you know, it is something. We do, however, also see Jaggers wearing a very similar puffed sleeved little short jacket, which is slightly perplexing. I would think, you know, Jaggers of all people would be sort of keeping up with men's fashion, and this is very much a backdated trend. I do think the mixture of decades is very interesting. It's very realistic when you think about it, of course, because, you know, it's so rarely depicted on screen that, you know, people have clothes that they've still been wearing for decades. The one exception to this is one dress that Estella wears, which looks very sort of 1870s or 80s bustle era, which again, by all means, let's play with the decades, but we can't go forward. She's not a time traveler, which, I mean, as far as I'm aware, I did read the book a long time ago though. I don't quite know what in the cottagecore is going on here with this bodice, but I'm gonna say for the most part, this gets the job done. Time traveling to the 1870s, once again in London, we have the Buccaneers. There are a lot of liberties taken with this show, mostly with fabrics and trim choice and silhouette. They're trying to go the more like Bridgerton route of this, of, you know, historical silhouettes, but like completely modern materials and fabrics. Some of the looks have the girls in absolutely no understructure, which is very, very strange looking. There are copious examples of corsets without chemises, which is so sad because this is actually a really nice period corset, except of course it's worn completely improperly and doesn't actually fit her. So the corset isn't supposed to flatten the bust in this period. In fact, we don't want things really tight around the upper part of the chest because again, that impedes with breathing, which we absolutely don't want to do. That's just logical common sense. I love some of the 1860s influence with the low, wide shoulder necklines on some of the more traditional characters. I do love, however, that they didn't fall into the trap of just putting all of the older characters in older fashions, just the more traditionally minded ones. The dowagers and the ladies and these people who would keep more to like traditional mindsets. Laura, on the other hand, opts for a more fashionable bustle. She's more keeping up with the times, which is great. You know, I love seeing people of similar age ranges sort of opting for different styles because of their varying circumstances and mindsets. It's cool. It's great. It's great attention to character, which is great. It looks like the party and event dresses are a bit more stylized, whereas the day dresses tend to stick slightly closer to the period. The women's hair in general in this show was done so dirty. 70s hairstyles loved a bit of top volume. We love to get elaborate and artistic with curls. We have really lost the art of the updo these days. There are so many different ways to sculpt and style an updo that is not just bridesmaid chic or, you know, like wedding chic, which seems to be like the default way to do people's hair for period dramas these days, which annoys me so much. This absolutely falls into the category of bridesmaid chic. This has to go in design choice. I can see they've looked at some period research, but you know, for the most part, they're kind of just doing their own modern thing. Next we have O Crime do Padre Amaro, which takes place in 1875 in Portugal. This is a Portuguese production, so The Crime of Padre Amaro. So we're in the mid-70s. I love to see that the crinoline is still making an appearance here. It's not like fashion was just sort of dropped automatically in 1868 when everyone decided they wanted bustles. Fashions, of course, don't just disappear overnight. So I love to see some of these characters still sticking with the crinoline silhouette, while some are starting to graduate more into the bustle era. So some of the women, of course, are starting to adopt that bustle-like skirt support under dresses. They're still very wide in the skirts because we are still, again, coming out of the crinoline period. What I really found interesting is that a lot of these skirts are still constructed like 1860s skirts. They're pleated or gathered all the way around rather than just focusing the fullness on the back. But these skirts are constructed as they would have been in the 1860s, as if these are 1860s skirts that they're just putting bustle structures under, which is great because that's absolutely what would have been done historically for people who can't just drop everything and buy completely new garments every season or every year. They would have been repurposing their 1860s skirts and just making them into the fashion that is becoming stylish. A couple of Amelia sleeve choices strike me as very 1890s, a bit more puffy sleeve than we would have had in this period. But for the most part, I'm going to say this gets the job done. Next, we have Unrest, which is set in 1877 in Switzerland. This, we have some really nice practical late 19th century dress here. I love seeing details like this bodice, which is actually sort of early 70s or 60s, and it's still being worn into the 70s, which is great. I love, again, to see people, you know, practically wearing clothes. I love seeing people functionally corseted. Fantastic. My main gripe with this, though, is that some of the girlies look a little bit Edwardian. They've got these large hats and sort of front puffy shirtwaists, as becomes very fashionable in the late 90s and into the 1910s. These would have been gorgeous were this set in like 1908. But alas, the show is supposedly set in 1877, so we don't quite have this sort of blousey, pigeon-fronted shirtwaist yet. I get we don't have a lot of high fashion people in this film, of course. So it is, again, odd to see that Edwardian influence, which I could understand seeing, you know, some bustle influence, which we don't see at all. If you want to sprinkle in a little bit of high fashion, you know, give us a bustle, not quite Edwardian. Otherwise, I'm going to say this gets the job done. Moving into the 1880s, back to my merry New York, we have The Gilded Age, Season 2. They really do stick to the fundamental late bustle silhouette of the 1880s, which is great to see. It definitely reads period, of course, even if some of the fabric choices are completely modern, and especially some of the hats are just very, very modern. Beautifully done, absolutely stunningly crafted, but you know, definitely got some modern influence in here. Not to say that the 1880s were beyond a novelty print. I have seen some extraordinary like shell printed cotton bustle dresses. And we do see a little bit of that in the show, but you know, some of these weaves and prints are definitely very, very modern. The Russells, who represent sort of the new money elite, definitely are the most outlandish in terms of dress, which kind of in a way like narratively feels very appropriate because they are flaunting their wealth in ways that like even the old money rich people find strange and garish. So it is kind of interesting to trigger that sense in the audience to be like, wow, this is a garish 19th century dress that is like weird and interesting, but like you can see that it doesn't fit in. And this is sort of what the old money people would have been viewing these people as. So like I get what they're trying to do. It's not representative of actual historical dress, but like I can see the sort of feeling that they're trying to evoke with the clothes here. And it's not like we just have the outlandishness on the new money people and traditional dress on the old money people. There is a little bit of cross-pollination, I guess, if you will. Like, for example, younger old money members like Marion is seen in some, you know, beautiful traditional period gowns and some more, you know, high fantasy and designed and outlandish modern style aesthetic gowns. I mean, it's kind of an interesting representation of how these new money people sort of end up having a lot of influence and power over fashion and how the fashions that they're experimenting with and wearing are influencing people, you know, outside of just their circle. So the younger people are starting to adopt some of their fashions, you know. So like, once again, I can see what they're trying to do sort of representatively, but it is not necessarily, we don't have evidence for this historically. This, of course, has to go in. It was a design choice. Next up, we have the series The Law According to Lydia Poet, which takes place in 1883 in Italy. The clothes in this are beautiful and fun and exciting and gorgeous and entirely the wrong decade. This show is supposed to take place in the early 80s. We are sort of just coming out of the natural form era and into the second bustle period of the 1880s proper. They seem to have skipped all of that and jumped straight to the 1890s. We are still about a decade too early for the styles that we're seeing in the show. We have lots of very specifically early 90s examples. Like this coat is practically straight out of an 1891 catalog. It's got that very specific sleeve that is very tall just at the shoulder, but is otherwise not too big and too puffy as becomes the fashion in like 1895, 94. Later, she wears much puffier sleeves, which are then reminiscent of sort of mid-90s fashion. She wears a blatantly Edwardian blouse at one point. Shout out to Teresa's hair, which seems to be the most 1880s thing in this entire series, and maybe this dress, which is conveniently shot in the dark. So great clothes, wrong period. I'm gonna say they tried. Next up we have the TV series Bodies, which takes place in several different periods, but has one section that takes place in the 1890s in London. It's pretty solid. I have a couple of like nitpicks. Some of the women's sleeves are a bit too large to be 1890. They only really start to get really large in like 1895, 94, like middle of the 90s, but 1890, 1891, again, we're still dealing with that little like tall puff at the shoulder, but otherwise not too big width-wise this way yet. I'm not quite sure why this man is wearing his cravat under his shirt and against his skin. This seems to be like a modern interpretation of the cravat that I have seen several times worn by modern people trying to represent history, but I have never seen this worn like this historically. These would have historically been really nice fabrics, really crisp fabrics that you wouldn't want them next to the skin. It just increases the amount that you have to launder them and makes them, you know, not look as nice more quickly. You want those over your shirt, which is the skin layer, and that's what gets laundered. The men's facial hair is fantastic. I'm gonna say this, it gets the job done. So moving into the 1890s, we have season 3 of Miss Scarlet and the Duke. We are once again in London. There are some really great pieces in this. Overall, the clothes are really good. A couple of Scarlet's jackets are particularly choiced for the 1890s. There is a fantastic late bustle dress, which is carried over from the 1880s, presumably, which is great. Again, love to see it. The main issue that I take with this season is Scarlet's silhouette. I don't know if they have her in a modern corset that is just compressing everything and does very few people any favors, or if the actress herself is just really petite and they aren't using any augmentation on her figure. But her silhouette is very modern. It is very unrepresentative of the period. This suit is actually really great on her because it gives her the illusion of some fullness in the back. And that is exactly what someone of her build would have done in this period. It's a combination of augmenting your foundation garments. It's utilizing the illusionary features of the clothing to give you those ideal proportions. So aside from that, which, I mean, it's not a small thing because it is, I mean, she is a main character and she does sort of stand out in not quite, you know, looking like she belongs in this period. But I'm gonna say, for the most part, it gets the job done. Season 2, Episode 3 of Loki has a flashback to 1893 to the Chicago World's Fair. So this is a great depiction of the 90s. We have some amazing men's facial hair representations. It's so spectacular in this period and they just ran with it, which is great. I love to see it. Some of the men's jackets do look a bit heavily padded in the shoulders. A couple of the girls could use a little bit more padding to get those, again, quintessential late Victorian silhouettes. Generally, though, it is pretty well done, especially for a very brief flashback in a superhero show. I'd put this somewhere like floating between it gets the job done and they tried. So, set in 1897 on a ship bound for London is the last voyage of the Demeter. Things are styled a bit more piratey for like a vibey effect, I think, here. We've got belted, untucked shirts. We've got the classic quintessential lace-up pirate shirt, which honestly I have never actually seen in history, outside of pirate films, of course. Ultimately, they're using some pretty solid historical pieces. The men's shirts are constructed accordingly. They're opening to the waist. We've got that long reinforcement piece at the waist edge just here. All that's really needed are these base layers since they're at sea most of the time anyway, and they can just style them accordingly however they feel. I mean, it gets the job done for what it is. Yeah. We have part 2 of The Nevers, which very secretly, very quietly was released beginning of this year. Wouldn't blame you for not being able to find it because it was deliberately very hard to find, and I am so not holding a grudge against the networks for this, but listen, this show is so underrated and what was done to the release of this show is so criminal. Anyway. The fit, the silhouettes, the details are all absolutely on point. I love the actual Victorian style shirts here, not just modern button-downs, which is fantastic. Horatio's shirt buttons only halfway, again, to the waist. It has that little button tab to attach to his trousers, which is so nice to see. They really, really understood the foundation layers and how clothes in this period are worn. Absolutely fantastic understanding of fit and silhouette and layering and how clothes move and are worn. I am just continually so impressed. And it's not like this is like, you know, a period film where people are just sitting around and embroidering. People are like out here kicking ass in these clothes, in corsets, in skirts. It just never fails to astonish me. There are some fantasy, like action movie elements to the clothes here. But these are all decisions that are made with a mind to historical logic, like they're decisions that theoretically, for the most part, can have been made within the framework of the 1890s, which is so much fun to see. We've got True belting the legs of her split skirt to be more aerodynamic for running. Like, fantastic. She absolutely could have done that historically. Bonfire Annie has detached the sleeves of a man's evening coat and is just wearing them separately like long gloves. Like, I can see the underlying structure of what this garment was. She's just styled it in a way that's more comfortable to her. And, you know, in a way that serves the more fantasy aesthetic of the show, but again, is something that absolutely could have been done within this period. We've got, of course, all the Melody Core girlies. They're layering petticoats and they're wearing things inside out, but the garments, these are all garments that theoretically could have existed within this time period. And once again, we have a range of different styles of clothing. We can compare Catherine's nice, respectable shirtwaist here. She's the wife of a doctor, you know, they can afford some common clothes that you could buy in a shop here. And then we've got Harriet, who's living at the orphanage. She wears a dress in sort of more an older natural form bustle style, but you know, it makes sense. She hasn't necessarily got the resources that Catherine has. Desiree then is also, she's still in a bustle gown, which is a little slightly outdated for this period, but it's a much newer bustle dress than Harriet's. So we've got different years and styles of gowns that, you know, people have carried with them for years and keep in their wardrobes. We've got lots of garment repeating, costume repeating through this because, you know, people don't have infinite wardrobes. Penance is loaned this evening gown, which I know is referenced from that one seafoam green Doucette gown. The original, I think, is dated to around 1899, which actually, incidentally, is the exact year of the show, so that completely makes sense. If we want to get really picky, True's sort of like fantasy leather waistcoat here, no idea where that came from. And Sarah wears a corset without a chemise. I still don't like to see it. So I'm gonna say, you know, this gets the job done. It was really, really well thought out. Like even slightly, it can peek its little head up into his peak. So we've got a rural setting here, which means we've got quite a bit of room to sort of play with fashions, which don't necessarily have to adhere to a very strict fashionable guideline. We have some great men's 1870s into 1880s coats here. We've got those close short lapels, that more boxy shape, which is quintessential of this period for men's coats. We've got almost a mid-century dress, which makes sense that, you know, it would have been kept around for a special occasion and would have been worn. So this blouse here has got a front sort of puff that was starting to become fashionable for the Edwardian period. I don't think it's actually constructed like this. I think it's just sort of like bloused a bit at the front, but you know, this could have been actually a very easy way for someone to get that sort of increasingly fashionable silhouette from an existing shirtwaist that they already have in their 1880s wardrobe. It looks like none of these women are wearing support garments, which is a little bit odd to me, but I don't know, maybe in the village that they're in, like that's just the norm. I don't know, I do question it though. I'm gonna say this gets the job done. Next we have A Strange Way of Life, which is set in the late 19th century, somewhere north of Mexico-ish.
Pretty obvious that a lot of this is very, very modern. In my general analysis, I would say that some of the layers might be correct in theory, but really we're missing the silhouette and the structure of the time period. In the 1890s, athletic and slim was the vogue for men's suits and tailoring. And actually this little like work shirt that Ethan Hawke is wearing is pretty accurate. The advent of the mail order catalog was a wonderful thing for these men working out west, and we have a ton of magazine advertisements for these work shirts. You're still going to see cottons, linens, lighter fabrics, breathable fabrics, lighter colors, easier to launder, especially if they're out working. So jersey knit fabric was a thing, definitely, and these sort of jersey knit clothes fitting with a button up, that was definitely super popular for men's underwear, either in two pieces or in one. I have personally never seen the boxer briefs, maybe in some kind of athletic capacity. I don't want to knock it, but more common than not would have been jersey knit, both top and bottom, full leg all the way down to the ankle, either one piece or two piece. And I think just in general, more fun Western wear. I mean, there was some really crazy stuff going on in this period, and it's really funky to our modern eye, and I think that they could have added those elements in and really gone somewhere fun with it. And then I have a little bonus here. This man at the end, the singer, gets my Best Dressed award. I think he has the most cowboy vibe. His hat looks great. I love his hat. I love his vest. I like how his costume looks worn too. So I'm giving him Best Dressed. The lovely ladies here, I can say that it's really bad. First of all, we've got some jewelry that is coming from who knows where, what culture, I don't know. If it's mine, I've never seen it before. We've got a lovely crop top too. I think what they're trying to go for here is the classic camisa, the blusa with a skirt and sort of a Mexican indigenous style. At this time period, really what you're seeing is women are starting to adopt Western fashion pretty much as a whole, and if they are keeping key elements of their Mexican culture, it's probably in the form of a rebozo, which is like a long shawl that you would wear, or maybe some of those embroidery elements. their clothing, to me, it's definitely like an exoticized fantasy version of Mexican cultural dress. It kind of ignores such a rich cultural history and so much material to pull from. My analysis is, this ain't it.
All right, we are back to Ain't It territory. Next up, we have The Creature, which is set in the late 19th century in Ottoman Turkey.
They've done a really good job with the menswear in this TV show, especially with the men's headwear. We know that it's late 19th century, and we can tell that specifically from the headwear. So they're wearing this red cylindrical cap called a fez, and it was very popular throughout the 19th century. And it actually changed style and shape according to the reigning sultan and his personal taste. So with the fez that the men in this TV show are wearing, we can place this TV series around 1880 to around 1900. One thing that I will mention, there is a problem with the women's clothing. So women's clothing in this time, especially with urban and upper class women, there was the outer jacket called a ferrage, and then on top of that jacket you had a little cape, and then you had a little hat that was almost like a mini fez called a hotoz, and it would be embellished and decorated with jewels and embroidered. You would have a veil called a yashmak, and the veil would kind of pin to the hat, so this was with the upper class and elite women. For some reason in this TV show they haven't put a hotoz, the hat, on any of the women, and the veils, in one scene the veil was just flying off, and that was what would happen if it wasn't pinned to a hat. So yeah, that was a bit The fabrics aren't very accurate, I think. There was a lot of taffeta that was being used. There was a lot of silk that was being used in the late Ottoman times, and you don't really see that in this TV show. The fabrics are quite thin. When we look at the extant garments and primary sources, they're much more embellished. You have frills literally everywhere. With the lower class people, they are wearing looser kind of clothes, things that look more hand embroidered and are stripy. So that was quite a good detail that they added in there. You see with the lower class men, they are wearing saddaks. So it's just like a piece of fabric that's been wrapped around a smaller hat. Even though the fez was really popular, it didn't really trickle down into the lower classes until much later. So that was a good detail as well. Overall, they've done a good job, but they could have done more research, they could have put more effort and done better. So I am going to say that they tried affectionately.
And once again, they tried. So next up we have the film The Peasants, which is a Polish film. It's set in 1904 in Poland. Theoretically, this is an animated film. However, because the entire film was shot first with actors in costume, there was a costume designer, and from there, every frame of the film apparently was painted in oils and made to animate, which it's just an extraordinary concept in and of itself. But because there was an original costume designer and there were original actual existing costumes, we did decide to include that in this ranking.
The costumes were probably slightly simplified for the purpose of the movie. That's why they seem to have gone for more generic peasant costumes that are not really reflected of the Łowicki region where the village is supposed to be located in. The main character is Jagna. Her costumes seem to have quite a symbolic meaning. So she's usually dressed in very strong colors. This dress doesn't seem to be very accurate for anything that was worn in that region, because you'd usually see women wearing separate blouses and skirts. So the blouses usually would be white or colored, but they would be plain, possibly with some embroidery, and the skirts would be made of those striped, colorful, home-woven fabrics. Normally, a woman of the region would probably wear a corset or a joint corset and a skirt, kiecka, when she would go out. So I was a bit surprised to see Jagna in those scenes where she's out and about and she seems to be dressed slightly informal. But I assume the purpose was to have a symbolic meaning of the dress. When it comes to the wedding scene, this is the scene where her dress seems to be maybe not fully accurate, but it seems to try to follow the regional dress. It also seems to briefly follow the description of the dress she wore, the wedding dress she wore in the book. However, this is not how those crowns actually looked in Łowicki region. The original crowns would be much larger, much more, let's say, bombastic to modern taste. They were very over the top. The peasant male costumes, they are quite accurate. So you see Antek wearing a sukmana, the long jacket that was characteristic. It's just that in the movie, most of the costumes seem to be based on a very casual peasant dress. So in most scenes, Yagna and other women would only wear a blouse or a shirt and a skirt, which is based on some of the paintings that inspired the visuals of the movie, like the paintings of Polish painter Józef Helmoński. Whereas I would say it would be more historically accurate if in certain scenes people were dressed a bit more formal in the movie. I don't think in certain scenes people would just go out only with the shirt and skirt or shirt and trousers. They would be wearing a jacket or, like a full dress. So the wealthier women of the village are visibly wearing a lot of beaded necklaces, korale, which were a sign of status because they were very expensive and they were passed down from generation to generation. Also, the older, wealthier women, they have more elaborate head wraps. And you can tell who's wealthier by the colors they wear, the textures on their clothes, and so on. They are not 100% historically accurate, definitely. I would be somewhere between they do the job well and it's a design choice. But I think in this case we can say they do the job well. It's very clear, I think it's easy to understand, and it's convincing, most of all.
So next we have an adaptation of Peter Pan and Wendy, which is set in 1904 in England. First of all, okay, Mrs. Darling is 10 out of 10. They really, really went hard with her hair. Very, very Edwardian silhouette, spectacular, great job, no notes. I wondered initially why Wendy was wearing drawers to bed, but then it all went completely fantasy from here, so it was merely foreshadowing. I get that the 18th century says pirates to us, but logically, why is Captain Hook wearing a 200-year-old coat, every day, constantly being degraded by humidity and salty seawater? And this is an early 18th century coat, if not a late 17th century coat, just based on the length and the width of those cuffs. This is literally a conservationist's nightmare. I guess the real pixie dust is given by this coat because there is no way this 200-year-old coat is surviving that long, but swag, I guess. This was a design choice. So we have the 1905 edition of Paris Police, 1905, set in 1905 in Paris. This was so close to giving Tis Peak, so close. Some of these street shots especially look like colorized scenes from the 1900s. It's literally insane. The Edwardian silhouettes, 10 out of 10. Details are pretty much all there. Starched collars, collar studs, the women's hair especially, 10 out of 10, sculptural perfection. Marguerite is a little bit unusual looking, but she does adhere to the more artistic dress trend, which was very much a thing during this period. It involves loose gowns, highly ornamental, very non-conforming to the period. So if she's one of these artistic dress girlies, she's gonna be a little bit unusual and we're just gonna have to deal with it. But these all look like materials and construction techniques that could have existed in the period, so I accept it. We do have lots of outfit repeating, some of the characters basically in the same outfit the whole time, which is 10 out of 10, very realistic. But then they went and committed corset without chemise sins, which it is Marguerite, so maybe it's supposed to be artistic, but some artistic dress people shunned the corset for rational dress reasons, but it doesn't make sense why she would wear the corset without a chemise. Either be pro-rational dress and have her discard the corset, or wear the corset properly. You know what I'm saying? That is such a an incomprehensible historical sin to me that I cannot in good faith give this a Tis Peak. This is it gets the job done with honors. Next up, in 1908 Vienna, we have Vienna Blood. This started out very promising with this fantastic Edwardian gown. Clara in the black and white is sort of a fashion person, so I guess she's kind of justified in this more outlandish piece that isn't what you traditionally see on a fashion plate. Fine. Otherwise, there are some pretty decent garments, but None of, at least the young women, appear to be wearing proper foundations, which throws off every single look in this entire thing. So not just no corsets, but like there are girls that historically would have been wearing some padding and some structuring under their gowns to achieve the desirable silhouette of this period. I get not wearing a corset at this time if you are more of like an avant-garde, like fashion-y person. Maybe Clara could get away with it, but like the seamstresses should all absolutely be corseted. These are working girls, they're trying to fit into a society that's like actively working against them. We do see photos of working girls during this period, and of course they're all wearing corsets. Not all of their corsets necessarily fit, you know, but they are wearing these like foundational structural garments that just like give you this essential Victorian Edwardian silhouette. And like I get some of the fashion is supposed to be like avant-garde Edwardian, but like some of it looks borderline 1950s, which is a little bit confusing. I'm gonna say they tried. Next up, staying in Vienna, we have Alma and Oscar, which takes place in 1912. I'm not gonna lie, I might have spent the majority of this wondering what period we were in. Alma wears this one blouse that was Edwardian enough, I guess. Some of the men aren't the worst, but most of the costume choices felt almost completely modern and like kind of into like vintage retro. At many points during this film, I was watching this unable to pinpoint this in a period, so I'm gonna say this ain't it. On to 1913 Denmark, we have Hiset, which once again we have no foundations, automatically skews every single look in this entire piece. At this point, like we're moving into more girdle territory, so you know we could be wearing girdles instead of corsets if you know we want to go that route. We've got completely modern hair. The period is almost unidentifiable at times. Again, this dress is almost Regency. I'm gonna have to say this ain't it. Sticking to 1913, we have La Promesa, which takes place in Spain. Okay, so to preface this, we looked this up to watch it and we found that there were 250 episodes. And we're like, okay, but which ones are actually from this season? No, all 250 of these episodes were released apparently since last November. So the scale that we're dealing with here is incomprehensible. I want to say that this series has When Calls the Heart syndrome. Most of these garments look purchased from high street shops that are sort of like meant to look a little bit like Victorian whimsical. The leads inexplicably have their hair half up in that sort of like period romantic way that is not actually historical whatsoever. Absolutely no one is wearing foundation garments. It's not just corsetry again, but none of these garments have any structure or padding in them in the way that they would need in order to produce a period silhouette. Foundations, I cannot stress this enough, are absolutely everything. Genuinely, some of the dresses are not theoretically bad. There's even some really great hair, but again, they're not worn properly, so like, what can we do? Like, I get it, there are over 250 episodes in this apparently, so like they're not going to be able to spend a super detailed amount of time on every single look. But you know, in terms of, are we viewing this as something reliable for history? It's not worse than the other ones. I'm gonna say like, it's like, it ain't it, but like it can poke its little head up into they tried. So next up we have The Haunted Mansion, which takes place in the modern day, theoretically in the United States, but we have many ghosts which appear from various different periods. I had a bit of difficulty with this one. First of all, most of it's shot in the dark, and then, you know, the ghost effect that they put on over top of that really obscures a lot of the details of the dress, which is like, you know, it is what it is. But like, there's this like ghost flashback of William that looks kind of, I mean, Regency, I guess, which might be the time period that we're working with here. But the hat is like trying to be 17th century Cavalier, which is not appropriate to the Regency period at all. I have no idea where you would have got that hat. There are definitely attempts made with the ghosts. You can see Constance's dress is trying to be sort of 1860s, for example. It's covered in flowers for some reason. You know, it's a fantasy piece, and you know, they're ghosts. You know what? It's a design choice. It's not, you know, strictly trying to evoke a historical period. It's just trying to evoke like these people are old, and it does that. Sticking with the theme of ghosts, we have what I believe is the final series of BBC Ghosts. We have a couple of new costumes here beyond just the same ghosts, which I believe last year ranked under They Tried. Kitty's sister here her dress is pretty good. We've got a nice overall silhouette and fit. The sleeves are still modern construction with that sort of gathered puff. More likely in the period they would have been pleated, but that's pretty common for, period dramas. The sleeve on Sophie is a little bit 1830s. Tudor women's sleeves either tended to be these little high sort of puffs or like low, wide, like bell sleeves. But we're keeping the upper arm pretty tight. It is a nice bodice though. Lord Bones' tunic and surcoat situation looks pretty good. The new costumes do feel slightly stepped up from the regular ghost costumes, but still I'm gonna rank this overall under They Tried. And there we have the final ranking for 2023's movie and show releases. Let me know your thoughts. Have you seen any of these? Do you plan to see any of these? What you thought of the costumes? Do you agree with my rankings? Do you disagree with any of my rankings? Where would you put these? Did you get bingo? When did you get bingo? Let me know all of your thoughts down in the comments below. As always, good to see you around here on the YouTubes. Subscribe if you would like more of these historical drama, historical costume, historical sewing adventures. Thank you to June's Journey once again for sponsoring this grand endeavor, for making sure that all of our wonderful participants could get paid. Thank you, of course, to our participants for all their expert wisdom. Thank you, of course, to all of our wonderful patrons for supporting this whole endeavor. I mean, the whole channel endeavor. It is always a delight to know that you are here just behind the camera lens. Thank you to the piggies. Thank you to my neighbors for putting up with me. We will see you back here in 2024. Well, I guess this is going on in 2024. We will see you back here anon.